I'm Tamar Blickstein. I'm a cultural anthropologist. I'm currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Venice and the Humboldt University in Berlin. First research project during the PhD in the Gran Chaco, my first research project in the Gran Chaco, was about how Indigenous people become erased from this national narrative in day-to-day practices and imaginaries of local people on the ground. So Argentina considers itself to be a nation of immigrants, a nation of European immigrants. That's at least what the common narrative is. They call themselves a crisol de razas, which means something like melting pot. And so it really does have this kind of European settler colonial mentality. There's also the story which is a true story with some caveats, that Argentina was founded on a land that it was founded on genocidal violence against Indigenous people. It is true that there is genocidal violence against Indigenous people. What is not true is that all the Indigenous people are gone and that they were all killed off. Then you had, white settlers who came from Europe with a capitalist mentality, who believed in progress and modernity, who brought civilization to this empty desert. So this is the ideological story. And you had certain laws. One of them was, I think, called the Ley Avellaneda, that were instituted in the late 19th century to attract agricultural settlers from Europe. They would specifically recruit people from places where there was some kind of economic hardship going on, or there were often people who experienced some kind of religious persecution. So people had reasons to flee. Sometimes it was just that they were peasants and they wanted to be kind of middle class as opposed to being peasants. So there's a lot of diversity that gets silenced and erased by this narrative, even historically, even when you're talking about immigrants. They were given, these were people who were not rich. They were offered plots of land, small plots of land of 100 hectares per family. But this is land that had been stolen from Indigenous people. And paradoxically, later you would have Indigenous, let's say, cotton pickers who would come to work on cotton plantations that might have been on lands that their ancestors would have been freely living on, hunting on, and that now they were in a kind of various kinds of exploitative labor situation. My current project is, of course, more to do with deforestation and how people experience deforestation, how people from different communities experience deforestation in similar ways and in different ways from each other. Deforestation rates have already been steadily rising in the region, but the pandemic has exacerbated this, and we see this all over South America, not just in the Gran Chaco, but also in the Amazon. There's research out that goes up until 2020, and what's really interesting is that they noticed that there was a steep rise in deforestation from 2019 to 2020. So that leads us to conclude that the rates of deforestation have risen in the Gran Chaco just like they have in the Amazon. And we can't say for sure why this is the case, but some speculations that researchers have and that local people have is that during the pandemic, people were at home, including government officials. A lot of people who would have been surveilling this or noticing it, including journalists, were just not there. And so you could get away with a lot more incognito. What shifted more recently is that people are just deforesting for its own sake, not knowing who they're selling it to, who's going to end up buying it. they know that the real estate value of deforested land is so high that they just have to deforest as quickly as possible, taking advantage of this pandemic moment where everything is, more things are possible, less eyes are on them. So this was a really big capitalist venture. If you've been to these forest areas, and if you know the people who are attached to these forest areas and how they've lived there, and then you see the satellite images, for example, of these areas just being burnt to a crisp, it is actually quite devastating. I mean, it's such a huge scale, and you know how much people's lives are wrapped up in these forests, and it's just, the magnitude is unthinkable. Indigenous people, when they lose the forest, experience the loss differently, because for them the forest is not just filled with things, living things called plants. For them, these are beings, and there are different kinds of kinship networks that they have with these beings, and it may be that there are ancestors living in the forest that have transformed into another kind of being, or that are partly some other being, or it might be that someone themselves feels that they are not only in their body, they are also in some part of the forest. So it's really devastating. I mean, it's very hard to think of how this can be undone.